course, your whole foot on the ground in good position. Okay, that's going to generally put more of an emphasis on the knee joint, right? And so that's not a bad thing. You tend to see a little bit more work in the quads there, a little bit less work in the spinal erectors and back because you're actually not supporting the weight horizontally, which is it's a much more difficult position. It's vertically stacked, okay? If I were to do it in the classic low bar squat, which is, again, lowering the bar further down my back towards more like my shoulder blades, I probably take a little bit of a wider stance. And when I squat, I drive my glutes back further away from the midline. In fact, as a general rule, if you take the midline of your body, the thing that moves the farthest away from that midline is likely to be the thing that's activating the most. So in the case of the front squat, you're not generally going to be using your glutes as much if you're in that, or not even front squat, just that high bar squat where you're very, very vertical. Your knees are going to be moving very far over your toes, which is fantastic. Therefore, it's a little bit more knee dominant, as can we say it. The other version here, you can keep your shins really close to vertical. You move your butt backwards. You're going to have to then lean forward with your torso, which means it'll be more low back, more glutes, and a little bit less knee. Now, that's a general statement. It's not necessarily always true, but as a guideline there, that is one exact exercise where you may be going, man, I'm trying to improve this clear weakness I have in my quads. I can't even leg extension my body weight. I have a significant problem there. So maybe in your particular case, if I'm hammering you or you're hammering yourself in a squat exercise and you're wondering why your quads aren't getting any stronger or aren't growing in any size, it may be because of the style of the movement. So I may need to go, Andrew, all right, look, squats in general, if you look at the research, are an excellent exercise for quad development. But for you, they're not. Because of the way you stand or just because of, neural activation, it doesn't matter. So I need to take you to a machine and isolate that muscle group so we can make sure we see development in that. So if you're trying to grow a specific body part, area, individual muscle, it's very important that you're actually seeing progress there. And don't worry about, well, in the textbook, the bench press is supposed to be good for your pec. Because if you're not actually moving the right position, or depends on the angle in which your sternum actually sits in your body, a bench press may actually be doing very little for your pec. And you may need to adjust to, say, an incline bench or a decline bench or a pec fly. So machines can be fantastic at letting you isolate without having to worry about things like stability, your low back position, getting hurt, where's your neck at. You can really concentrate on just the movement, concentrate on the muscle, and let everything else kind of go away and ensure you're getting training in that specific area.
Those are excellent recommendations. One thing I wanted to ask about is prioritizing specific body parts and therefore specific exercises. And here I'm not necessarily referring to trying to bring up a so-called weak body part, an area that tends to be either genetically deficient, because in some cases, I learned, for instance, having seen a lot of competitive track and field championships, I love watching track and field as a spectator. Go up to Hayward Field in Oregon whenever there's a meet. And, really love that. The sprinters are amazing. They have some of the highest calves in the world that I've ever seen. I mean, little micro calves, but they're fast as hell.
They're right behind the knee, and they have a very long distance between that calf and their foot, which makes it propulsion excellent. Right.
They wouldn't stand a chance as a competitive bodybuilder.
Nope.
But because something different is being selected for in bodybuilding, but obviously they're magnificent for sprinting. Most people, of course, reside somewhere between the extreme of, very long muscle bellies from, origin to insertion, or very, very short muscles. Usually people have one or two body parts that they want to emphasize for whatever reason. These days it seems to be people are really, what are they saying now? Like glutes are the new biceps, or biceps are the new glutes, or I don't know. Anyway, you see this stuff.
I love them both. By the way, I am so pro curls in the squat rack.
There you go.
Love it. Right.
There you go.
Nobody kill me.
So everyone has their thing, but that they would like to emphasize. But I have a question, because we're specifically talking about hypertrophy, which is, should people give themselves permission to not train a body part if their goal is balanced hypertrophy? I'll give a couple of examples. One of the reasons why I've, for instance, not done a lot of free weight squatting is because despite my quadriceps being rather weak, according to you, they tend to grow rather easily relative to other muscle groups.
Yep.
And the goal for me has always been balanced development.
Yep.
And so I emphasize hamstring work, and I emphasize calf work and hamstring work. It's not that I don't train my quads at all, but I do far less for them, and I avoid the big compound movements for them. I I occasionally do them. And again, this is not about what I do or don't do.
Yep.
But I think that in the context of a conversation about hypertrophy, is it appropriate to give people permission to say, listen, if you're just genetically, strong, large lats, doing a lot of chin-ups and rows might actually be the worst thing for you if your goal is balanced development. And I ask because I don't often hear any credentialed people give people permission to completely avoid training a given body part if their goal is balanced development. And yet I think most people who are resistance training are seeking balanced development. I don't know anybody that actively wants to have big upper body, small legs. I think that comes from neglect and laziness in most cases. Sometimes it's injury related or other things. But I think this is an important point to raise, that any good program for hypertrophy, I would think, would have to take into account people's genetic and natural variation, sport-based variation in which muscle groups just tend to grow easily for them and which ones require a lot more focus and work.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, you have permission to do or not do anything you'd like to do in terms of hypertrophy training. I generally would not recommend disregarding a muscle group entirely. I know that's not what you actually suggested, but just to make sure that people didn't hear it that way. What I would do is, in this example, is I would continue to do those big movements. I would just keep the volume low. So I might do 2 sets or something twice a week. There's a whole bunch of reasons. You want to make sure that those motor patterns are there. You want to make sure that especially the benefit of these compound movements is you get to work so many complementary muscle movements at the same time. So in the case of like a loaded squat, you're not only working stability in the hip as well as the knee, but you're also working upper body. Your rhomboids are keeping you in position. Your neck has to stay in position. Your toes, everything is working. And so it's really difficult to get those things when you take that movement out and you replace it with, say, a machine hamstring curl. That whole element of balance and neurological control is very, very important to maintain over time. And that just gets removed if you go to machines only. So I would keep some of those things in, maybe even not all year round, but maybe 1 quarter of the year, 2 quarters every other, rotate it, something like that. As long as you're not, if the reason you weren't doing, say, those squats was because you're like, it hurts my back or something, okay, great, then leave it out. But if it's just simply you don't want your quads to grow too much, I would just keep that volume low and do something just to kind of touch it, keep it activated, and to maintain all those other things like flexibility, range of motion. I would bet anything your adductors are probably underdeveloped. Right now, you can get those by doing your squats because you're not really doing, I'm sure, much adduction training. And so there's things like that just get lost when you're only thinking all big muscle groups that come inherent in doing the larger movements. And so you don't have to worry about them or train them separately.
I appreciate that. And in reality, I do 2 to 3 really hard work sets of hack machine squats per week, which is plenty for me to maintain and even get a little bit stronger.
Yeah.
But per our earlier discussion, about a year ago, I shifted to doing very low repetition ranges to maintain strength in that movement.
There you go.
But I am actively avoiding hypertrophy in that muscle group.
Yeah. Or another solution would actually be do something like 1 set to failure a week. Not even extremely long. Just, do something in the 8 to 15 repetition range at the end of all that strength set, and just get a little bit of pump there, and then just so that those muscles can touch that level of fatigue, touch that level of strain and mechanical tension, walk away.
Great, thank you for that. What about exercise order?
Amazing. So implicit in this exercise choice thing, it's what you're going to notice is these modifiable variables interact with each other, right? And you can clearly see how when we talked about volume, and to clarify, volume is the repetitions multiplied by the sets. That's typically how we express volume. Well, that's going to be directly influenced by intensity. The heavier load you put on the barbell, the less repetitions you can do. And the inverse, right? Rest intervals. The shorter you keep your rest intervals, then either the lower the weight has to go, the intensity, or the lower the rep range has to go. Order is the same thing. Choice is the same thing. So all of these things modify each other. They play a little bit of a hand in what everything else does. So with the exercise choice thing, rolling into exercise order, you get to play a couple of games here. When we talked about strength and power, I basically said stick to the big movements, most complicated and compound movements first. You don't have to do that with hypertrophy. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can do the thing you're just simply most interested in first. You can do this thing called pre-fatigue. So say you're going to do a back day. You could go in and do nothing but isolated biceps as your very first exercise and then roll into your pulling movements, because what you'll see is during most pulling activities, the biceps are a secondary or tertiary muscle group. But you've pre-fatigued them. You've guaranteed that muscle of most interest got its most training in, and everything else is secondary. So you can start, if you want, with single joint movements. You can start with isolation stuff, or you can start with compound stuff. Either way, it just really comes down to preference and what you're specifically trying to develop. Now, this also goes back to the exercise choice question, right? Because it's sort of the same thing, right? Like, which one am I choosing? And where I wanted to cap this was the exercise splits. And so we just sort of talked about, am I doing body part splits? And I know a question I get a lot here is, well, which ones should I package together? I'm not really concerned with it. All you should worry about is how many times per week, and in fact, total volume you achieve on a muscle group per week. And it doesn't really matter how those things are folded in. It's really a personal preference issue. One mistake that we see here commonly is grossly underappreciating that the legs are not a muscle group, right? So the legs have a whole bunch of muscle groups in them. So we see a classic split like, I'll do shoulders and chest Monday, and then I'll do, biceps and forearms Tuesday, and then legs Wednesday, or whatever, and then back to upper body. And then you're like, wait a minute. You have 4 days dedicated to the upper body and 1 for quote unquote legs. Well, you can see the imbalance. That's going to happen there over time is you're going to do far more upper body than you are lower body, and that's not appropriate. So you just want to think about your lower body like you would do. If you're going to do body part splits, then include those things as well, and don't just chunk everything in as legs once a week. If you want to do that, that's actually okay, but that day has to be very, very challenging, and you probably should do quite a bit of volume there, because you're almost surely not going to hit the total weekly volume needed to optimize muscle growth if you're literally only doing once a week of your quote-unquote legs.
So along those lines, let's talk volume.
Yep.
How much volume does each muscle group need per week in order to generate, and for that matter, maintain hypertrophy?
Right. So the kind of minimum number we're going to look for here is 10 working sets.
Per week?
Correct.
Per muscle group?
Correct.
And just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, if I do a chin-up or a pull-up, I'm going to mainly be training my back muscles, my lats, if I'm doing it correctly.
Lats and rhomboids and biceps.
Right. But there'll be indirect targeting of the biceps. So would you include indirect targeting? So for instance, if you said 10 sets per week, let's just use biceps because it seems that that's the go-to generic muscle. Why is that, by the way, that when people ask somebody to, flex their muscle, they always flex their bicep. They don't flex their calf or their quad or their glutes or something. I guess there's some, public decency issues.
Well, I can tell you, with my children, that's the very first muscle I taught them to flex.
Their glutes?
No, they're biceps.
Oh, I was going to say, all right. Good. Good. Healthy parenting advice from Dr. Andy Galpin. So if it's 10 sets per week for biceps, in order to maintain or further grow the biceps. But does that mean if somebody does 10 sets of chin-ups or 10 sets of chin-ups in rows that they are checking off any of the boxes for biceps, assuming that they're doing the movement properly and targeting the major muscle group that a given movement is supposed to target, which in my mind, when you're doing chin-up, you're supposed to mainly be using your back muscles, and then there are secondary muscles or secondary activation of other muscles. But of course, some people, their arms grow like crazy when they do chin-ups and their back doesn't grow at all. So this is where we're back to the kind of genetic preloading of the system, if you will. So how does one meet this 10 sets per week minimum when dividing different body parts and thinking about this direct and indirect activation?
Right. So two things. There's no specific exact rule here. And this is why these set ranges are ranges. Right, and this is why we don't say like 10 is, so 10 would be sort of the minimum number you want to get to. The more realistic number that most people, especially if you're advanced or even intermediate, is more like 15 to 20 working sets per week. Okay, now if you're very well trained, you probably want to even push more towards like 25. And in fact, past that, there's just not a lot of research. So the optimal number may be 30. We don't really know. It's just hard to get that much work in. It may actually even be detrimental.
And here we're referring to natural athletes. That is, people who, for whatever reason, either because they're not taking any prescription drugs, or maybe if they are, whose levels of steroid hormones, mainly the androgens like testosterone, et cetera, do not exceed the normal reference range values. Either because that's what they are naturally or that's what they're replacing through pharmacology. Whereas when we think of, technically, someone could be taking exogenous hormones to replace a deficiency, and then they're still in normal range. Okay, but I just want to clarify, because you work with athletes in a number of different sports where drugs are and are not tolerated, et cetera, and the general population, that what we are talking about here is for the general population, not for steroid using athletes.
Correct.
Okay. Great.
So 10 was just sort of that like absolute minimum number to maintain, which is actually pretty cool if you think about it this way. If you went in and you did 3 sets of 10, it's a very standard
3 sets of 10 repetitions.
Correct. You're already at 3. You did that 3 days a week. You're at your 9. That's almost 10. If you also just went to the gym 1 day a week, you did 3 sets of 10, and you did 3 exercises, you're at 9 working sets. You're basically done. So achieving 10 sets per week per muscle group, and now we're not even talking about indirect activation of a secondary. So you're going to hit 10 fairly easy. Extension to that, hitting 20 is actually still not that hard because of what's actually going to happen there. So in your example, if you're doing your chin-ups, would the biceps count? There's no exact rule there because there could be technique issues. It could be hand position. So you mentioned chin-up very specifically. A chin-up is actually going to put your hands in this position where your palms are facing up, right? This is supination and pronation. So you're going to be there. Well, that's actually quite different than a pull-up where your hands are in the opposite direction. So a chin-up actually is going to be pretty good activator of your biceps for most people. So you would expect actually to probably count that because it's going to be very difficult to not see some fatigue in your biceps, depending on your mechanics, depending on, and by that I mean just the segment lengths of your bones, right? That's where your muscles originate and insert. There's nothing you can do about it. It's not even a technique or a focus issue. It's just simple fact, the matter of that's how you pull best in that area. The position in which your hands are on the barbell, wider grip, more narrow grip, it's going to change muscle use. So we talked about earlier, I think in the previous episode, that exercises do not determine applications do, but exercises do determine things like the movement plane, the joint you use, and typically the eccentric-concentric sort of ratio, as well as oftentimes the muscle groups involved. So there's just not a lot of things you can do depending on how you are built of, some exercises activating a secondary group and you don't want it. So it's not always a technique issue. It may just be that's how you're built, right? And the same could be true for a squat, the high bar versus low bar sort of example we talked about earlier. It's, you can see plenty of evidence on muscle activation studies where people even doing the vertical back squat style have tremendous glute activation, and folks doing the low bar have tremendous quad activation. So a lot of it depends on personal mechanics. So what I counted is the question. Really, you just have to ask yourself, number one, do you really care that much? You have a range to get to. If you were anywhere between 10 to 25 working sets, you're fine. So if you count it or don't count it, it's just going to change the difference between whether you did 17 working sets or 23. And either way, you're fine. So I don't really care. Number two, are you actually feeling anything there? So if you're doing your chin-ups and your biceps are blowing up, I'm counting that, right? If you're doing it and you're like, no, I don't feel any fatigue there, it's all then I'd probably say, okay, we're not even going to count that as towards it. So you can just let that guide you a little bit towards your count.
Yeah, I've always noticed that there are certain muscle groups that are very easy to isolate when under load. And those are almost always the same muscle groups that are easy to contract very hard without any load whatsoever.
Bingo. That's actually really insightful. So you can kind of use this heuristic of like, if you can contract your lats just standing here, you're probably going to contract them very well when you lift. If you can't, you can probably assume about the same thing's going to happen. So you'll know. The lats are actually really interesting because they tend to be one of the more difficult muscle groups to learn how to activate. So if you're in your journey and you're just like, I have no idea, and you can look up like a lat pose. So how do you puff your lats out? How do you show it? And if you do that and you're like, wow, there's no movement here, just recognize that's extremely common. And that it's probably going to take you many, many, many months of trying before you start to see some movements, and probably even a few years before you really start to see activation. So you're not some sort of like specific, like special genetic anomaly. It's very, very common. It's uncommon to not be able to activate your biceps, right? That everyone can do that. But if you're just like, man, I can't get this here, I'm just going to stop doing it. Do not do that. Just keep at it and just keep concentrating and thinking about that muscle group. It will take some time. It's very common to have challenges activating lats.
Yeah, I've noticed that many of the muscle groups that were responsible for a large fraction of the work in the various sports that I played as a young child are muscles that are very easy for me to selectively isolate and induce hypertrophy in. I suppose I'm one of those mutants where my lats happen to be one such of those muscle groups, but I think that's because I swam a lot when I was a kid.
Literally going to ask were you a swimmer.
Yeah,
that's like a telltale sign.
Yeah, every kid in my town swam and played soccer.
There you go.
And then later I skateboarded and did some.
You generally hear that
boxing
answer
and things
is
of that sort.
You either were a swimmer or you were a wrestler. So it's like that pulling and pull toward you is thousands of repetitions allowed you to get very good at contracting.
But because I also played soccer and skateboarding, but I didn't do any baseball, basketball, or football, muscle groups like deltoids are very challenging to activate and isolate.
Yeah.
So I do think that early development is superimposed on a genetic template that sort of predicts which muscle groups are going to be easier or harder to isolate and train.
It's also a very good case for why it's important to do as many different athletic activities as you can in your youth.
Yeah, and if you do skateboard, definitely learn to ride switch, because every skateboarder I know has one leg that's larger than the other and one calf that's larger than the other. And actually, for that matter, people that do martial arts that don't learn to, if they're not southpaw, if they don't learn to switch up and do their work southpaw, you see the same thing. I mean, you're building an asymmetry into the system, and it's not just muscular; it's neural.
Oh,
strongly
for sure.
neural.
Yeah.
So yeah, kids, parents, get your kids doing a bunch of different things. I suppose gymnastics would probably be the best sport all around in terms of movement in multiple planes and activating all the different muscle groups.
Yes and no. There's a lot of benefit, no question about it. There's a lot of other things though that has limited ability. So almost everything in not like gymnastics is great, but almost everything in that is pre-planned, which is a major downfall, right? So the joy of skating is there's so much proprioceptive input that you have to make decisions very quickly in small windows. Now you have a little bit of that when you're flipping in the air and you have to land, but gymnasts tend to have a very specific routine that they're working on, and they work on that routine for years. Think about it. So
skateboarding for me was transportation. It was freedom, and it didn't require any coaches or parental oversight.
Yeah. Ball sports have the beauty of reaction and things like that. So all of them are wonderful. Good to do a lot of them.
You've established that 10 really to 20 sets per week is the kind of bounds for maintaining and initiating hypertrophy.
Yep. If I were to flag one of them, I would say 15 to 20 is the sets that you want to get working. Now, it gets complicated when you ask, well, how many reps per set do I have to get to? Okay, well, we also can complicate that by repetition type and tempo. Just sort of let all that go for now and just think if you're getting close to that range, you're in the spot. And all you have to do now is balance two things: recovery and continued training. Okay, so if you're somewhere in this 10 to 20 working sets range and you're in a position where you can continue to do that, you're not so sore and so damaged and beat up that you can't maintain that volume for 8 weeks at a time or at least 6 weeks at a time, then I'd probably say either the style of repetitions, the amount of repetitions per set you're doing are too much. The volume is getting to you. However, if you're not seeing adaptations, then I'd say maybe the repetitions aren't enough. And so that's the kind of game you're running. Now, there could be plenty of other factors.
Intensity.
Of course. Yeah, intensity, intent, and then, of course, the other things: sleep, nutrition, etc. All these other things that go into our visible stressor category that we always analyze. This sort of brings up this idea of responders and non-responders. So we get this one a ton. So why is it some people, my gym buddy, my roommate, we go to sleep the same time, we're on the same nutrition plan, we work out together, she triples in muscle size and I don't have no gain whatsoever. Well, there's a lot of work that we're trying to do to identify the molecular mechanisms behind responders and non-responders, because they clearly exist. In fact, this is one of the reasons why every paper I basically will ever publish again, if I do, always reports individual person data. So rather than group averages, you get to see, if there's 10 subjects in it, you get to see how each of the 10 responded. Because the group average can get confusing. What you really want to see is how many actually people got better, how many got worse, how many maybe changed, and if so. So we'll always report those individual data because when you go to train, you're not the group average. That's very important to know. All right, so if you do that, you can see a beautiful line of these hyper responders, the bell curve in the middle of the normal responders, and those folks who, like through any training study, just won't get any better. If you can tease out, which you can't, but let's say in science you could tease out all the extra factors, total stress load, hydration, sleep, etc. What you often see is non-responders, a lot of the time, it's not that they have a physiological inability, it's just that they need a different protocol. And a lot of times they just need more volume. So if they can handle that and they're not excessively beat up, just give them more volume and they tend to see a lot of breakthroughs. You see the same thing with plateaus. So typically it's sort of just like, okay, the routine you're on, you've been on it for too long. We need to either go to the other end of the hypertrophy spectrum for intensity, which means like if you've been in the like 60 to 70% of your 1 repetition max range, maybe we actually need to go heavier. Take our repetitions down, maybe even our total volume down and go heavier. Try that. A great way to break through plateaus of grain if all the other boxes are checked. The other one is do the opposite, which is like, okay, we're going to go higher. We're going to go set to 20, set to 25, very high repetition range, and really get after it. Not to do as much damage because you don't tend to get as sore from those really high repetition ranges. You'll get more sore from the lower repetition, higher intensity range than you will typically the other ones. And see if we can bust through some plateaus there. So it just generally means you need to do something a little bit different than your training partner.
So we've talked about exercise choice, and we've talked about the number of sets that one needs in order to induce hypertrophy per week. What about repetition ranges? You've mentioned pretty broad repetition ranges. How many repetitions per set is required in order to induce hypertrophy?
Yep. So there are 2 caveats here before I give you, well, the number is somewhere between like 4 to 30 reps.
30 repetitions.
Absolutely. In fact, I think you can go much higher.
The first 20 have to feel exceedingly light.
Correct.
And during those first 20 or so repetitions, is the goal still to contract the muscle as hard as possible on each repetition?
So this is the caveats here. So caveat number 1 is there is an assumption that by the end of this set, you're getting somewhat close to failure. And so you don't have to go to absolute failure to induce muscle hypertrophy, but you also have to get kind of close. So if you're going to do a set of 25 and you finish it and you're like, ooh, yeah, like that was kind of starting to get hard at the end, that's not going to be enough. If you're going to do a set of 5 or 6 and the same sort of expression comes out of your mouth, it's not going to be. So in that case, it doesn't matter your rep range if you're not getting somewhat close to failure. Again, it doesn't need to be complete failure. A good number to think about is like -2, which is what we call reps in reserve, which is sort of like I got within 2 or so reps of failure and then I stopped.
And can we define failure, at least for sake of this portion of the conversation, as the point at which you can no longer move the resistance? It could be your body, it could be a weight, a machine, etc. That you can no longer move the resistance anymore in the concentric phase of the exercise movement in good form.
Correct. That's a really nice momentary muscular failure is how we typically define it. There's a wonderful review, I think it's open access, that just came out in the last handful of months. Eric Helms' team out of New Zealand. Eric is a great scientist and a very experienced physique coach and a competitor himself. So he knows a lot about this area. And that paper went through all the exact definitions in detail, all the caveats that we're not going to have time to get into today. So I would recommend folks like check that out if they want more information, but I'll try to get to the highlights of it right here. So what they basically showed is going all the way to failure in the defining failure like you just did, right? So momentary muscular failure, you can't complete another repetition through complete range of motion, through whatever range of motion you determined prior to, as well as with good technique, so other body parts aren't being compromised, sort of, et cetera. And doesn't need to be total failure, that -2. Failure is still needed in caveat 2, which is, again, very, very highly trained individuals. You won't see people who are like Eric or other folks who are 6 to 8 to 10 years into very serious training who don't have to go to failure probably a little bit more than what I just said. So the layout that they brought in their paper was very nice, and they basically said, okay, here's a couple of scenarios in which going to failure is maybe the best way to do it. Number one, you probably should do it on a little bit of the safer exercises. So maybe taking your back squat on a barbell to complete failure and doing that as like a standard protocol multiple times a week, it's maybe not the best choice. So maybe if you're going to do barbell back squats, you take that to your 1 or 2 reps in reserve, stop there. It's a lot of work. It actually, going back to our discussion of the Prolipin chart, it's a similar idea, right? Where you're going to spend most of your time in these working sets, 70 to 90 sort of percent. And then you're going to take that failure to maybe the hack squat machine, or maybe even to the leg extension machine. So a little bit of a safer exercise. They also can tend to be single joint exercises, don't have to be, but they're just ones that are not as complicated, and you're not likely to injure other body parts when you're doing it, all right? So that's one way to go about it. Another way to go about it is simply doing it on like the last movement of the day, right? And so again, you're not going to do it on your first 3 or 4 exercises, but whatever your last finisher is, you'll hit total failure on that one. And that kind of keeps you in a range of, yeah, you hit some failure. You got a lot of overall work done. So that's a lot of stimulus. That's a lot of noise going to that nucleus that says grow, 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 grow. But you didn't totally obliterate yourself, especially if you don't have the assistance of anabolic steroids. Right. That's very, very important. If you have those, you can push this a lot harder because your recovery would be significantly enhanced. If not, you kind of want to walk away from that.
I have to assume that 99% of people listening to this do not, and yet among those who are not taking anything in terms of anabolics, there I think is a large range of recovery quotients out there. Some people just tend to recover better. Some people I think also are far more diligent about what I would call the necessary but not sufficient variables of adequate sleep, proper nutrition, limiting stress, and so on.
Yeah, I can't wait to break all that stuff down. I've got a very long discussion for all those things.
We will get into it in all its practical realities and actionables before long. What about rest between sets?
Great. This is the interplay now. So one actually thing we said for a long time is you want to stick between 30 to 90 seconds of rest between sets for hypertrophy. And that's because you're trying to activate this metabolic disturbance or disruption. You need a little bit of a burn, a little bit of a pump to go there. More recent research, a lot of this out of Brad Schoenfeld's lab and others have shown that that's just doesn't seem to be the case. Again, for moderate to newly trained individuals, whether that's the case for the highly trained folks, I don't necessarily know. I don't think there's any difference here. So you can take up to 3 to 5 minutes of rest in between sets and be fine. The caveat here, though, is this. If you're going to rest longer, that means the metabolic challenge is lower. So you need to then increase the challenge in either mechanical tension, which think about as weight, load, or muscle breakdown. So you can't lower one of the variables, keep everything else the same, and expect the same result. So if you're going to have more rest, then you need to either preserve the load on your bar or the volume. One of the two has to happen. So this gives people a lot of opportunity. I generally tell people, if you're going to train for hypertrophy, it's probably best to stay in the 2-minute range at most. You can go longer, but a lot of people have a hard time actually coming back and then executing that next set with enough intent to get there, and or it's going to make your workouts tremendously long. So you can stick to the shorter one. You don't have as much mechanical tension, but that's okay. You can still get there. But in reality of it is, you can do whatever you would like.
Tell me if this is a reasonable structure, given what you've told us. 3 exercises per muscle group. First exercise, slightly heavier loads. So repetition ranges somewhere between, let's say, 5 and 8, with perhaps hitting failure or close to it on the last set. Rest periods of somewhere between 2 or let's get wild and say 5 minutes.
Sure.
Okay, so it's a little bit more of a strength type workout at that point. But then moving to a second exercise of 3 or 4 sets where the repetition range is now 8 to 15, shortening the rest periods to 90 seconds or so. And then on the third exercise, repetition ranges of 12 to 30. This number 30 kind of makes me wide-eyed. I can't remember the last time I did a set of 30 thinking it was for hypertrophy, but what you're saying makes absolute sense and is research backed. So very short rest intervals, maybe 30 seconds between sets. Would that allow somebody to target all three forms of major adaptation? I mean, in my mind, it works. You know, you're talking about mechanical loads, you're talking about stress and damage, and you're talking about metabolic stress. Is that better than to, for instance, do all the high repetition work in one workout per week, and then higher loads in the other workout? Does it matter if you divide them up or combine them?
It would not matter. I would say it matters in the sense of your personal practical situation.
Well, long rest. For me, I love training heavier with longer rest.
Great.
But I'm hearing that there's real value to doing these higher repetition ranges.
Yeah. So the formula you set up there in a second is great. If you want to do it the other way, that's fine. It's kind of idiot proof. You can set this up however you'd like. You could actually do the inverse. Theoretically, you could do the sets of 30 first and then move to your sets of 8. It doesn't really matter because we're trying to just get to a certain total stimuli and you're going to hit it eventually. So you have a lot of room to play here. You also have a lot of room to adapt based on your circumstances. God, I'm short on time today. Typically, my workout takes me 60 minutes for this plan I have. I've only got 35 today. What do I do? Well, if you're training for strength, that's a different answer than if you're training for hypertrophy. If you're training for hypertrophy, you need to make sure you hit that total volume. So in this particular case, lower the load, lower the rest intervals, and just get to the burn and get going as much as you can. If you're training for strength, I would rather you cut your volume in half. Get those few repetitions done at that high load and just don't do very many sets today. That's a better result. So the goal that you're going after is going to determine what we call chaos management, which is that thing like that, running out of time today, my time is short, or I didn't even think my time was short, something got cut off, I'm not feeling it today, I'm in a hotel, et cetera, which is life, right? And that's gonna be 10 to 50% of your workouts is gonna be chaos management. Well, how you make those decisions is gonna go back to understanding, number one, what goal you're going after, and then number two, what are the physiological consequences, we call these physiological limiters for each one, and that's gonna tell you what to select and prioritize, the volume, the intensity, or whatever else.
I'd like to ask about frequency, but I'd like to frame it a little bit differently than that. I'd like to ask about total workout duration, which dovetails with frequency, because if one is hitting the appropriate number of sets per week and one is combining different muscle groups on the same days, well, then workouts are going to be a very different duration than if one is doing a different body part each day, for instance. And so I feel like any discussion about frequency has to be within the context of workout duration and vice versa. Yeah.
If you are a lifting junkie and you're very consistent in your schedule, I'm actually okay with body part splits. Most people are not that. And so the concern there is if you say are isolating and waiting to do your glutes on one day of the week and something happens on that day, you might go another 13 days now before training it, between workouts. And that's really difficult to maintain. The frequency won't be high enough unless the load and volume on that one day is astronomically high. It's just not going to happen. So while if you look at the research, frequency in terms of how many days per week doesn't matter that much as long as the total load and failure are equivalent. Practically, it's a challenge. So it's hard because life gets in the way for most people, especially if you have kids and a job and all these things out there. So I actually prefer doing something more like 3 days a week of total body. And if something happens, you've just missed that body part for 48 hours, 72 hours. I like that a little better for most people, not because it's more effective, but just because it's a little bit more resilient to life. And you can get there. If you wanted to actually do a little bit of a combination, so if you wanted to do like 2 days a week of whole body and then 2 days a week of a little bit of a body part split, then you're actually sort of hedging against all risks there. As long as you get to that total number there. Now, there is actually some evidence in a couple of ways that maybe a little bit more frequently is a little bit better. But the difficulty is now going back to the practicality question of like how many people really can train just their strength training 6 days a week. That doesn't count any of their long duration stuff. It doesn't how their high heart rate, their flexibility, okay. It's just really, really, really hard to get all that stuff in. So it tends to be easier on folks in terms of execution and long-term adherence. In my opinion, to get that volume accomplished in a little bit more frequent patterns, but not once a week. So I like to kind of have it right there for most people. Not because it is technically quote unquote more effective, but because you're less likely to fail to progress because of skipping a workout, something popping up, your power going out, and your garage door being locked on you or whatever.
Yeah, imagine that. That happened to me this morning, folks. Couldn't get out of my driveway because the electronic gate was down because the power was down. Anyway, solved that problem.
Yeah.
The way you describe it, my sense is that workouts will last somewhere between 1 and 2 hours of real work. Is that about right?
It doesn't have to be nearly that long. I mean, you could certainly get enough work done in 30 minutes. If you're
even
doing
a whole body workout.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're doing that 3 days a week, so remember the numbers we're trying to hit here. Let's say we're trying to hit 15 working sets per muscle group per week. That's 5 working sets per day per muscle group. So if you did one exercise for that day, let's say you did squats, you did 5 sets. You did that 3 days a week, you're done. There's your 15.
But there are other muscle groups to hit on the same day you're doing squats if you're doing whole body. Correct?
Yeah, so you've gotten them all already. And so like all the leg muscles in that example are taken care of.
So you would not do separate hamstring work necessarily?
You wouldn't need to. Now, hamstrings is actually a little bit of a caveat. Like that's a good example of an exercise or a muscle group that's probably really good to make sure you isolate. It's challenging to get with your standard deadlift and squat. It's one of the probably ones that's most important to go target outside of that. But in theoretically, though, outside of that, you would get most of your leg muscles done with even a single exercise. And even if you wanted to change it up. So you said, all right, Monday, I'm going to do a squat variation. Wednesday, the next day I lift, I'm going to do some sort of deadlift hinging variation. And then maybe Friday, my third day, I'm going to do some sort of unilateral, maybe rear foot elevated split squat or something like that. All right, maybe even a lateral lunge, maybe a different plane. Okay, you're in a pretty good spot. You're going to hit most of those muscles to your 15 working sets, especially if you take sort of that last set each day to pretty close to failure. That's going to get some more serious work done, but you're not going to be so fatigued you can't come back and train it a couple of days later, and you'll be fine. So you could even split that up into 2 days a week. And now all you really have to do is hit something like 7 working sets. So maybe that's 2 exercises per day, maybe some sort of a leg press and a leg hinge, 3 to 4 sets each. You can hit 6 to 8 sets that day. You do that 3 days a week. Now all of a sudden you're at that 20, 24 sets. Bada bing, bada boom. Same thing with your upper body. I just gave lower body examples because, I like the lower body more. So it's not that challenging to get to those numbers and split. And those workouts can be extremely short. So if you were doing that 3 days a week, you're doing that one exercise upper body, one exercise lower body. That certainly shouldn't take more than 40 minutes.
I'm happy to hear that, not because I don't like training.
Yeah.
Please excuse the double negative. But I've found that resistance training workouts that extend longer than 1 hour of work, and certainly longer than 75 minutes of work, leave me very fatigued.
Oh, sure.
And fatigued to the point where concentrating on cognitive work throughout the day can be challenging, need a longer nap in the afternoon. I'm a big proponent of naps in the afternoon in any case, but requiring longer naps in the afternoon, et cetera. So at least for me, restricting the resistance training workouts to about 50 to 60 minutes of real work, for me 3 or 4 times per week, has helped tremendously. So it's a case where doing higher intensity work in a shorter period of time and actually hitting muscle groups less frequently, for me that's, again, once directly, once indirectly, has worked really well. And as you mentioned earlier, this could very well be explained by not my recovery quotient as some sort of genetic or physiological variable, but the way that I'm training. And indeed, I like to do a few forced reps and go to failure on too many sets, and weaned in that genre of training.
It's also fun, like to just train hard.
It is.
It's really fun.
It is. I think that I've learned a lot by training to quote unquote to failure.
Of course.
I think there's a lot of learning in there, provided it's done safely. But what you're describing actually inspires me to at least give a try to these other sorts of splits and ways of training for hypertrophy and strength, because this notion of not necessarily having to go to failure and still being able to evoke strength and hypertrophy adaptations is a really intriguing one. Dare I even say a seductive one. And that leads me to a question that is based on findings that I've heard discussed on social media, which means very little, if anything, unless it's in the context of people who really know exercise science. And you're one such person. And that's this idea that because resistance training can evoke a protein synthesis adaptation response, but that adaptation response lasts about 48 hours before it starts to taper off, that the ideal, in quotes, frequency for training a given muscle group for hypertrophy is about every 48 hours. Is that true?
Yes and no. So a couple of things there. Remember, in order to grow a muscle, there's multiple steps here. So you have the signaling response, which actually happens within seconds of exercise and can last, depending on the marker, up to an hour or 2 hours. Step number 2 then is gene expression. And when we see that that's typically peaked around 2 to 6 hours post-exercise. And then you have, following that, protein synthesis. And that's that longer time frame, somewhere between 12 hours there. It's certainly not peaked for 48 hours. It may be still there 48 hours from now, but it is absolutely coming down at that point, depending on sort of a number of factors. So that part of it is sort of true. So this is a combination of like some half-truths and some like maybe just pedantic things that aren't really that important to differentiate. The real question, I think, is like, okay, is it okay to train sooner / is it better to train sooner, or actually is it better to wait longer? There's no real reason to think that you need to train, if the goal is hypertrophy, any sooner than 48 hours afterwards. I can't think of an advantage that would confer. I also can't think of any practical applications, athletes, physique, bodybuilders, coaches that ever found tremendous success doing that. So I would be very skeptical that is in any way better. Now, could you do it in some instances of, say, you've got travel coming up like that, so that you just, yeah, of course.
You want to preload the system by destroying the
Totally.
muscle?
No problem.
And then waiting 7 days or 14 days. I've known people who have done that before.
I do it all the time.
Vacations or layoffs.
Every time. Like every single time.
So annihilate themselves and then take a
Totally.
2-week layoff?
Yeah, and it's like there's no benefit there other than psychological. Like, I just love it. Like, it feels great to be super sore. I feel less crappy not training for those couple of days because I'm like, I'm super sore anyway.
You need the extended rest.
Yeah, of course. And it's just like, it's just a crappy justification in my brain that, like, an excuse to do something really wild and that I totally don't need and get way sore than I should get.
Dr. Andy Galpin's suggestions of what not to do, but that he does.
Yeah, 100%.
Right.
So,
do as I say, not as I do. The famous words of every research professor.
yeah, I think 48 hours is a reasonable time to wait. Can't think of any advantage of going sooner than that. There's really not a tremendous amount of advantage of waiting much longer than that. Certainly 72 hours is fine. As long as you're hitting these concepts we've talked about, you can let really life determine that. I mean, there's situations too with like particularly our athletes where we have to kind of break that because of schedule obligations. They're playing every 5th day, every 3rd day or something like that. And you're just going to have to lift on back-to-back days. You're just going to have to get it done. But yeah, I can't think of why I would go out of my way to do that.
The second part of that question is, let's say somebody trains a muscle, they train it properly, they hit it in the appropriate rep ranges and appropriate rest, et cetera. The stimulus is there, the adaptation is set in motion, they're getting somewhere at 48 hours or so a protein synthesis peak, that's going to taper off.
Yeah.
But they don't train it 48 hours later or 72 hours later. They train it 5 or 6 days later, not because they're lazy, not because they don't care, but because they have other priorities that are woven in with getting hypertrophy in this muscle, right? Sure. There are people who exist only to get hypertrophy in a given muscle group, but let's be fair, most people would like to grow that muscle group. But then, does it necessarily mean that the muscle starts to revert to its pre-hypertrophic state? That is, does it atrophy and get smaller again? Because if it doesn't, I could see a lot of reasons for hitting a muscle group once every 5 days or 7 days, provided you hold on to the hypertrophy that you initiated 5 or 7 days ago.
Yeah, there's no reason to think you will lose anything in that sort of a time domain, 5 to 7 days. The only challenge with training that infrequently is, can you actually get enough total volume done? So if you're going to train a muscle once a week, you either have to go to real failure, real damage and soreness, or you have to figure out a way to hit 20 sets that day in that muscle. Not at all impossible, especially if you're thinking, well, actually all I have to get is 15. And I'm going to do 5 sets of 3 exercises. That's not outrageous, not at all. So like absolutely possible. If you're wanting to go more towards 20 or getting closer to that 25, like now it starts to get pretty challenging. So scientifically, the research will suggest it's going to be equally effective. Practically, it's challenging for people to hit sufficient volume without just being so demoralized afterwards because they're in so much pain they can't get out of their car because their legs are so trashed. They can't sit in the toilet and get back up without crying from pain. So
that's not good.
No,
that's not good.
I say that because those are actual examples that have happened in my life.
Yeah, I'm realizing as we're having this conversation about ways to stimulate hypertrophy that I've sort of defaulted to more intensity as opposed to volume because of the time factor. I have a lot of other things going on in my life. And so within that hour, I can't get enough sets in across all the muscle groups I need to hit. And I'm only going to do it about once a week. Yeah. And so it's, at least for me, more advantageous to just train extremely hard. I actually use the pre-exhaustion technique that you mentioned before, or pre-fatigue as you referred to it, of hitting something really strong with an isolation exercise, then doing compound exercises. I'm starting to think, based on what you've told me, that pre-fatigue and then a compound exercise, in some ways, it's not really 2 sets. Because if you're going to failure, forced reps, you're kind of pushing past failure, then you're doing a compound exercise, and you're doing that 2 or 3 times. Well, that sounds like 4 to 6 sets, but the force repetitions are almost like an additional set, right? And so it's not 20 sets, but it's 4 to 6 really, really hard sets that go beyond what we normally think of as a set.
Totally.
Okay, it's sort of the difference between running on concrete and running on sand. When I go for a sand run, it's a very different experience.
Totally. Yep. Okay. And this is why I should have mentioned this at the very, very beginning of our chat today, but all of these numbers that I'll give you for any exercise adaptation, you cannot think of them as hard lines. They are gradients. And so when we think about the number for hypertrophy in terms of repetitions, I said 4 to 30. Well, what do you think happens at 3? Do you think hypertrophy just stops? Right? In fact, the number you'll see in the literature is more like 6 to 30. I actually slide it down to 4 though, like personal preference because of that. But it just fades away. What do you think happens at rep 31, 35? It just fades gradually over time. So you actually sort of brought this up in one of your earlier questions, and I'm not sure if you were even thinking about this, or maybe you were. I just babbled on about something else. But if strength happens between this like 1 to 5 repetition range, and hypertrophy typically happens in this like 8 to 30 range, what happens if I were to do sets of 6, or God forbid 7? Like 7 and 9 are these numbers you just absolutely don't do in strength training, right? It's just like sets of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, got 8, 10, 12. Like, do not program a set of 13.
Now when I'm training, sets of 7 and 9.
Yeah, it's great, right? We'll use sets of 7 a lot with weightlifters because you can actually count numbers more effectively. But
what happens in 7 to 9 rep
great
ranges?
So this is actually a wonderful area of these like 5 to 8 repetitions where you're going to get a nice combination of a lot of strength gains and a lot of hypertrophy. So someone who's coming in going, man, I want to get stronger and I want to add muscle. What do I do here? Well, that's actually a really nice answer. Train pretty hard in that like 4 to 8 repetition range, and you're going to get a lot stronger and you'll still induce a lot of hypertrophy. If you want to really maximize hypertrophy, I would probably spend most of your time in the 8 to 15 repetition per set range. You can go up to 30. Admittedly, though, I don't think it's optimal to spend most of your time at more than 15 reps per set. It's very challenging to maintain the focus required at rep 27 to actually get sufficient failure by rep 30. You just give up way too early. It's hard to do. The same thing at the bottom end of that spectrum in terms of really heavy to get there. So I really honestly think 8 to 15 is still, it's cliche, it's that textbook number, but that's a reason that's a textbook. It is tried and true and very, very, very effective. If, for instance, you want to get stronger, though, and not invoke a lot of hypertrophy, you have a couple of tricks you can pull. Number one, stay south of that 5 repetition range. You do sets of 1, sets of 2. Go as heavy as you can with all appropriate considerations, and stick within maybe even up to 3 reps per set. You start getting to 4 to 5 to 6, now you're going to start itching towards that hypertrophy range. So stay down there. Do a lot more total sets. So do a classic example would be something like 8 sets of 3, right? You're going to get a lot of practice. You're going to get 24 very high quality reps with a lot of rest in between. Okay. You go from there, you go to managing caloric intake, making sure your protein is still on point. You want to recover. But if your total calories aren't greater than 10 to 15% above your maintenance needs, then you're not going to be able to put on a whole bunch of muscle mass because you just don't have the fuel for it. You can also then space your workouts out so that stimulus isn't coming extremely often. So if you do that thing a couple of times a week, it's not enough frequency in that signal So remember, that signal has to be frequent or loud. You didn't make it super loud, and now you're not making it super frequent. You can get very, very, very strong like that and put on very low amounts of hypertrophy.